Dear students, happy to meet you all through this online mode of education. I am Dr.S.Angelina Glorita Parimala, Associate Professor of Zoology, A.D.M College for Women, Nagapattinam. The topic I am going to discuss with you today is about the community ecology, which is coming under the paper Environmental Biology. Now we will see what is community. Community is defined as a set of organisms existing within a defined area. Simply we can say a group of population living in a unit area. The next is about the community ecology. It is the study of the interactions between the organisms and the interactions between the organisms and their environment. The next is about the types of communities. Kenda in 1974 divided the biotic community into two types, major community and minor community. Major community is a large community which is an independent unit, self-sustaining and self-regulating and comprised of different minor communities. A forest, pond, desert, meadow, lake and grassland are some examples of major communities. Several minor communities form a major community. A typical example of major community is a forest that comprises of several minor communities enclosed with different animal communities. The next is about the minor community. It is smaller in size, not dependent on other communities for growth and survival, but it is found in major community. Minor community is simply defined as it is a part of major community. For example, group of barnacles, oysters, algae, polychaetes, etc. Generally, a community is composed of both plants and animals as their interaction is must for the survival of community. Under the similar environmental conditions, similar type of species found in communities which tend to overlap each other, and because of several variations and other variations, animals may shuffle between communities. Different species of population have overlapping terrestrial ranges where they coexist in a particular limited area representing a community. The next is about the characters of community. Here we can see the 8 characters. Number 1, community diversity or trophic organization. Number 2, community structure. Number 3, ecological and community dominance. Number 4, community stratification. Number 5, community interdependence. 6, Ecotone Edge effect. 7, ecological niche. 8 is about the ecological succession. Let us see the first, community diversity. It means the existence of many different kinds of plants and animals in an environment. The degree of variation of life forms within a given species, ecosystem, biome or an entire planet. Species richness. It is the number of species present in the community without regard of their abundance. Species evenness. It is the relative abundance of the species that are present. Species diversity. It considers both the number of species richness in the community and their relative abundance, evenness or equality. Communities with higher diversity are more productive and more stable regarding their productivity. They are better able to withstand and recover from environmental stresses. They are more resistant to invasive species, organisms that become established outside their native range. The next is about the trophic organization. Each organism within a community can be categorized within a specific trophic level, which relates to the way in which it obtains nutrition. These trophic levels can be divided into 3 groups: primary producers, consumers and decomposers. First, primary producers, also known as autotrophs, manufacture their own food or usually green plants and algae. Green plants synthesize food for the entire community and hence are called producers. They take up carbon dioxide and water with dissolved minerals from the surroundings and change them into complex organic compounds, foodstuffs, by means of energy obtained from sunlight. This process is known as photosynthesis. The next is about the consumers or heterotrophs must obtain their nutrition from other organisms. All animals, including man and a few non-green plants, depend on green plants directly or indirectly for their food. They are known as the consumers of the community. Consumers may be herbivores or carnivores. The animals which feed on plants, plant eaters, are called herbivores or primary consumers, and those who feed on other animals, flesh eaters, are called carnivores or secondary consumers. The next is about the decomposers, which are also heterotrophs, consume dead plant and animal material, recycling the nutrients back into the earth. Some organisms like decay bacteria and fungi break down, decompose the dead bodies and excreta of the producers and the consumers into simple substances. For example, carbon dioxide, nitrates and phosphates, and make them available to green plants for the synthesis of food. Such organisms are known as decomposers. This diagram shows the ecological levels starting from the organism to ecosystem. Organism, the next is population, the next community, that leads to ecosystem. Communities can be described by the way that the energy is transferred through these trophic levels. For example, in a grassland community, the grass primary producer is consumed by a mouse, primary consumer, which is consumed by a snake, secondary consumer, and subsequently an eagle, tertiary consumer. The dead body of the eagle may be consumed by fungus, decomposer. Each interaction from the sun's energy to the decomposers makes up a link in the food chain and in food web. This diagram shows the food chain and food web. Food web structure influences the stability of communities. Trophic levels are influenced from above by predation and from below by protection. This diagram shows trophic pyramid. Here it starts from producer till the primary consumer, then secondary consumer, that leads to tertiary consumers. Trophic pyramid, also called an energy pyramid, showing the progression of food energy. The pyramid base contains producers, organisms that make their own food from inorganic substances. All other organisms in the pyramid are consumers. The consumers at each level feed on organisms from the level below and are themselves consumed by organisms at the level above. Most of the food energy that enters the trophic level is lost to the heat when it is used by organisms to power the normal activities of life. Thus, the higher the trophic level on the pyramid, utilize the lower the amount of available energy. The next is about the community structure. Community structure is related to both the species richness and the species diversity. Community complexity measurement, which takes in the species richness as well as their relative abundance. Communities in which species exhibit higher species richness and evenness are considered to be more diverse. The structure of a community may be determined by its natural history, that is, the chance colonization event of a population into an island, by the influence of an abiotic factors such as the climatic pattern, the geography, and the habitat location, or by biotic factors such as the presence of other organisms in that area. Species diversity is equal to species richness plus relative abundance. Species diversity of a community is the variety of organisms that make up the community. It has two components, species richness and relative abundance. Species richness is the number of different species in a community. Relative abundance is the third one is ecological and community dominance. The ecological dominance means the presence of dominant species. It refers to the most of the population in a climax community. Ecological dominance is the degree to which a species is more numerous than its competitors in an ecological community or makes up more of the biomass. Most ecological communities are defined by their dominant species. For example, in tropical coastal waters, the dominant are corals. On Earth, a large amount of its land ecosystems are dominant. Human beings, the ecologically dominant species in a planet. Tidal swamps in the trophic are usually dominant species of mangrove. Some sea flower communities are dominated by brittle stars. Exposed rocky shorelines are dominated by sessile organisms such as barnacles and limpets. Next is about the community dominance. There is usually one or two species at each trophic level which are more dominant, influence over the function and structure of the community than others. This may be due to their physical size, population numbers, or activities that have an impact upon other organisms or the environment. These are called dominance, can have a major effect on the nature of the community. Plants usually dominate land communities, and the name of the community is often based on the ecologically dominant vegetation. The ecological dominance may be responsible for modifying the abiotic conditions of a habitat, although rare species might be equally as important for the correct functioning of the community. The next is about the community stratification. Natural climates communities usually exhibit some form of stratification by which the populations that make up the community are distributed into defined vertical or horizontal strata. Organisms may not occupy only one stratum, moving between the layers, often on a diurnal basis. For example, a bird that feeds on the forest floor during the day. A community may occur along a horizontal stratification where there is transition between successional stages and ecotones. The next is about the types of stratification. There are two types, vertical stratification and horizontal stratification. Vertical stratification refers to the vertical distribution of organisms in a community. Sunlight is the main cause behind the development of vertical stratification. It is found in forest community, grassland community, and in aquatic communities. Example, stratification in forest community. Generally, a forest community shows 5 vertical strata. Number 1, subterranean strata, basal portion covered by litter and debris of plants as well as animals. The next is forest floor, second layer, abundance of litter. This region is a zone of decomposition. The third one is stratum of herbaceous vegetation, third layer formed by herbaceous plant like grasses, dicotyledonous annuals, etc. Stratum of shrubs located below the crown layer and above the herbaceous layer represented by shrub. Stratum of tree, topmost layer also called crown layer, which represents highest limit of plant community in a given region. The next is horizontal stratification. It refers to the distribution of individuals on a horizontal plane in the community. In a terrestrial community, the individuals may be distributed on the floor in 3 ways, namely uniform, even, clumped, and random. Uniform or even dispersion, individuals are separated by a fairly even distance. It occurs as a result of social interaction. Here the individuals trying to get as far away from each other. In this dispersion, there is a presence of limited resources, competition, and nesting. The next is about the clumped dispersion. Here the individuals are clustered together. It occurs when resources, food, water, living spaces are clumped together. All the species have a certain social behavior. For example, herding animals, flocks of birds, hives of bees. The next is random distribution. Here the location of one individual is independent of the location of the other individuals. This is the patterns of dispersion, shows clumped, uniform, and random distribution. The next is about the community interdependence. Communities are not just a random mixture of plants, animals, and microbes. Each of the organisms within a community has a fundamental dependence on at least one another, although other organisms will engage in multiple interactions. There are 3 main forms of interdependence. Number 1, nutritional interdependence, 2, reproductive interdependence, and number 3 is protective interdependence. Number 1, nutritional interdependence. It describes the transfer of energy and nutrients through feeding. Certain organisms may be more reliant on the presence of others to fulfill their nutritional requirements. For example, insects that can feed only from one species of plant. The next is reproductive interdependence. Can take several forms. A common example is that of pollination, which is present within most communities. The interaction provides a food source of nectar for the plant, and the interaction is essential to its reproductive success. Certain species may only be able to reproduce on a particular plant and are therefore dependent on the presence of this within the community. One is protective interdependence, is the third main interaction. Most organisms require a level of shelter and may rely on other organisms within the community. For example, insects living on a tree are dependent on the leaves and branches to shelter them from predation by birds. Interactions between community members are not always linear and can involve several highly complex interactions. Many of such interactions may take place only under precise environmental conditions. An example of this is the symbiosis between corals and the photosynthetic algae, which live within their body structures. The next is about the ecotone and edge effect. An ecotone is the transitional area between two biomass where communities meet and may integrate. Many organisms may be part of several different communities because they have various geographic ranges and density peaks. If these boundaries are wide, it is known as an open community. A community in which the species all have similar geographic ranges and density peaks resulting in a discrete unit where the boundaries are well defined is called a closed community. Open communities tend to occur where there is a long environmental gradient such as that of soil moisture content. Closed communities occur where there is a sharp change in the vegetative structure or the physical environment. For example, an area of a beach which separates the water from the land. Ecotones are generally very hard to define because within an ecosystem, there are usually organisms which can disperse between both open and closed communities. This is the ecotone marshland which formed between the two ecosystems, that is between the ecosystem 1 and 2. Ecotone is a zone of junction or a transition area between two biomes. Diverse ecosystems. Ecosystem is a zone where two communities meet and integrate. For example, the mangrove forest represents an ecotone between marine and terrestrial ecosystem. Other examples are grassland between forest and desert, estuary between freshwater and saltwater, and river bank or marshland between dry and wet. This is a diagram shows the formation of estuary between freshwater and seawater. The ecotone between an agriculture field and a forest is a man-made one. The ecotone prevails environmental conditions intermediate to both two adjacent communities. The ecotone may be as broad as 100 kilometers or as narrow as 1 kilometer. It often offers an abundance of food and shelter. It contains organisms of both community. As a rule, ecotone contains more species, often denser population than either of the neighboring communities. This is called edge effect. The ecotone contains certain species which are completely restricted to this region and they are called edge species. The next is about the importance of ecotone. They have a greater variety of organisms. They also offer a good nesting place for animals coming in search of a nesting place or food. They serve as a bridge of gene flow from one population to another because of the larger genetic diversity present. They can act as buffer zones, offering protection to the bordering ecosystems from possible damage. For example, a wetland can absorb pollutants and prevent them from seeping into the river. Ecotones are also a sensitive indicator of global climate change. A shifting of boundaries between ecosystems is thought to be due to climate change, so scientists and environmentalists are studying ecotones with greater interest now. Ecoline is a zone of gradual but continuous change from one ecosystem to another when there is no sharp boundary between the two in terms of species composition. Ecoline occurs across the environmental gradient. Gradual change in abiotic factors such as altitude, temperature, salinity, and depth. The next is about the edge effect and also about the edge species. Edge effect refers to the changes in population or community structures that occur at the boundary of two habitats. Sometimes the number of species and the population density of some of the species in the ecotone is much greater than either community. This is called edge effect. The organisms which occur primarily or most abundantly in this zone are known as edge species. In the terrestrial ecosystems, edge effect is especially applicable to birds. For example, the density of birds is greater in the ecotone between the forest and the desert. The next is about the ecological niche. Niche refers to the functional status of an organism in its community. According to A.D.M, niche is the profession of an organism in a community. Niche includes which it eats, how it behaves, how it responds to the environment, and the interactions with other organisms in the community. It refers to the unique functional role and position of a species in its habitat or ecosystem. In nature, many species occupy the same habitat, but they perform different functions. A species in a niche includes all of its interactions with the biotic and abiotic factors of its environment. An ecological niche describes how an organism or population responds to the distribution of resources and competitors. It plays an important role in conversion of organisms. If we have to conserve species in its native habitat, we should have knowledge about the niche requirements of the species. Next is about the types of niches. Ecological niches may be of two types, narrow niches and broad niches. Narrow niches are the role or function in the community or ecosystem has more finely subdivided and the species is specific. For example, muddy, sandy, rocky shore fauna. Then broad niches, here the species functions in the community is more of the generalized. They are either specialist or generalist with reference to the niche. For example, forest and pond community. Ecological niche is the total of an organism's use of biotic and abiotic resources in its environment. Many species occupy the same habitat, but they perform different functions. For example, oak tree in a deciduous forest. It provides oxygen to plants and animals. It provides a home for squirrels. It provides a nesting ground for blue jays. It removes water from the soil. This diagram shows the presence of 3 species of warbler birds search for insects as food in the forest at different levels in the tree and so occupy different niches. This is a diagram. Here we can see the different species of insects feeding on different parts of the same plant. Generally, the habitat of the species is like its address, whereas niche can be thought to its profession. A niche is unique for a species while many species share the habitat. No 2 species in a habitat can have the same niche. This is because of the competition with one another until one is displaced. This is an example in the forest community and pond community. Niche refers to the unique functional role and position of the species in its habitat or ecosystem. The functional characteristics of a species in its habitat is referred to as niche in that common habitat. In nature, many species occupy the same habitat, but they perform different functions. Habitat niche, where it lives, food niche, what it eats and decomposes, and what species it competes with. That is reproductive niche, how and when it reproduces. Then physical and chemical niches, temperature, landscape, land slope, humidity and other requirements. Niche plays an important role in the conversion of organisms. If we have to conserve species in its native habitat, we should have knowledge about the niche requirements of the species. The next is about the growth form and ecological succession. A community can be described by major categories of its growth form. For example, herbaceous plants, shrubs or trees. Ecological succession is the progressive and predictable replacement of one type of community by another over time. There are 2 types. Primary succession is the initial colonization of a bare landscape which has not previously been occupied, often following a significant ecological disturbance such as a volcanic eruption. Number 2 is about the secondary succession. It occurs where a community has existed previously but has been removed from a landscape, for example, an area of deforestation. In this case, the nutrients within the soil are already present and conditions for growth are favorable, and so secondary succession happens much more rapidly than primary succession. The third one is autotrophic succession. Here the presence of dominance of algae. Fourth one is heterotrophic succession. Here the dominance of heterotrophs. The next is about the characters of the succession. The succession is caused due to the modification of the habitat. The kinds of programs changes continuously with succession. The diversity of species increases, biomass can also increases. The first stage of community is pioneer community. The final stage of community is called climax community. This diagram shows the conversion from pond community to forest community, the process of gradual and directional change in the structure of the community through time, from open field to forest. This diagram shows the grassland to high trees. Changes in structure and composition of the vegetation result in changes in the animal's life that depends on vegetation as habitats. Successional changes over 30 years in a western Pennsylvania field, cropland or grassland, grasses, widely herbaceous plants that changed into shrubs, then finally cherry, pine, aspen, then changed into forest of maple, oak, cherry or pine. Some important key terms. Community, a natural population of plants and animals that interact ecologically and live in one place. Dependence, the quality or state of being influenced or subject to another. Ecosystem, The complex of an ecological community and its environment functioning as a unit in nature. Independence, the quality or state of being free. Interdependence, dependent upon one another. Neighborhood, the people living around each other. Organism, an individual living thing. Ecosystem, the biological community of organisms which interact within an environment. Population, the number of individuals from one species which occupy the same area and in which inbreeding occurs. Habitat, the natural home or environment of a species or population. Trophic level, different levels within an ecosystem in which organisms have a same function and nutritional relationship within a food chain. Dominant species, most abundant, highest biomass, powerful control over occurrence and distribution of other species. Richness, number of species and abundance. Ecological succession, transition in species composition over ecological time. Reliant community returns to former state after disturbance. Resistant community changes little in response to disturbance. Climax community, ultimate association of species achieved. To conclude, community is an assemblage of animal and plant species occurring together in a particular area. Community may be small or large, depends on the area and the population of several organisms. Different types of species in a community interact with each other and form a system with its own emergent properties. Hence, a community has its own structure, behaviors, development, and history. Thank you.